James Calvin Hollabaugh, my great-great-grandfather, and Travis Smith were best of friends. They were in their teens, and everything they did it together. They lived in East Tennessee, about where Jonesboro, Johnson City, Tennessee. That was where they were living. And like I said, they did everything together. Well, almost everything. You see, Travis Smith had fell in love with a young woman who had moved into that area and was living in a log cabin by herself. And Travis Smith would go and he would spend many hours with her in that log cabin. And it was just before the Civil War had started. Travis Smith and this young lady spent so much time together that she became in the family way. And she begged Travis to marry her. And he said, "Oh, Emily, I will marry you, but right now, James Hollabaugh and I are going to go off and we're going to fight. And we're going to defeat them damn Yankees." And James Hollabaugh and Travis Smith got their canteens, filled it full of white lightning, got on their horse, and rode to the nearest commandant and joined the 19th Tennessee Cavalry. James Calvin Hollabaugh was made a second corporal, and Travis Smith was a private. But they had made a pact with one another that if one of them were wounded, that the other one would get them off of the battlefield. And at the Battle of Pine Ridge, it happened. Travis Smith was shot in the upper thigh with a minie ball, fell from his horse. James Hollabaugh rode his horse over, picked him up, set him on the back of his horse, rode out of the battle to the hospital, the regimental hospital. Left him there for the doctors, and James Hollabaugh never saw Travis Smith alive again. Travis Smith was transferred from Pine Ridge, Arkansas, where the battle took place, was transferred to Richmond, Virginia, where he spent several weeks in the hospital there in Virginia. And every day there was a widow, and she would come and she would visit the soldiers. Because the hospitals were so crowded, she had offered to take Travis to her home and help him recuperate. And so Travis moved in with this widow woman. She had lost her husband at Shiloh. And they got along pretty good. In fact, they got along so well that after a while, her profile changed. And the baby was born, and the war was over. And Travis really didn't want to leave because the food was good and so were the fringe benefits. So he really didn't want to leave. And then one day, a bedraggled, one-armed man wearing an old, worn-out Confederate uniform started walking up to the house of this widow. When she saw the man, her face turned almost completely white. She ran down the steps of the porch, threw her arms around the neck of that one-armed man, laid her head on his chest and began to sob. She wasn't really a widow after all. He had just lost an arm at Shiloh. He wasn't killed. And she said, "My husband, there is your toddling little son." And he looked at her and he was amazed that while he was gone for 2 years, he had a son. Well, Travis didn't wait to see how she was going to explain that to him. He hopped on his horse and rode off. He would eventually wind up in Texas, where he rode the cattle trails from Texas up to Abilene and Dodge City. He got in fights and saloons, but after a few years of riding trail dust, he decided he really wanted to get back home. And so he rode for days until he made it back to East Tennessee, where his parents' farm had been. When he got there, the cabin was burnt down. His family had disappeared. But he wanted to go back and see Emily. He had promised her he would marry her when the war was over. And so he rode those few miles to Emily's log cabin. When he got there, the flowers in front were beautiful. The cabin was well kept. He pulled on the latch string and went inside. She was sitting at the hearth. She was more beautiful than ever before. He said, "Why didn't I come back sooner? I can't believe how beautiful she is." And he says, "Howdy, you remember me?" She ran and she threw her arms around him and she kissed his face. And he tried to explain why it had taken him so long to get back. And she put her fingers to his lips. She said, "Come with me." And she took him by the hand and she sat him down at the table. There were all kinds of wonderful foods. And he ate until he couldn't eat anymore. And she said, "Come with me." And she took him by the hand and she led him to her bed. And that night, they made passionate love. And the next morning when he awoke because water was dripping in his face. And when he looked up, the roof of the cabin was gone. And he looked around the cabin, and it was in disarray. The walls had begun to fall down. Even the fireplace had collapsed. And he felt something hard and sharp pain in his side. They had fell asleep arm in arm the night before. And when he looked down, there was a skeleton laying beside him. The yellowed skin was still stretched over the bones. And he could tell it was Emily. The pale yellow skin, he could tell. He looked around the rest of that room, and in one corner was a crib with a very small skeleton in that crib. He began to cry. What had happened? What had happened? He threw himself and scattered bones all over the cabin, and he began to run outside of that cabin, and he was crying and he was running as hard as he could run, and he was crying and he was running as hard as he could run, and he ran and he ran and he ran until he fell down dead. Not from heartbreak, but from terror. Now that's the story that my ancestors, the Hollabaws, had passed down to me. It's called The Skeleton Bride.